Hi, it's Margaret, and thank you so much for joining me here on the Gardening Me. A few days ago, I got back from the Perennial Plant Association symposium in Niagara Falls. And as is always the case when I go to events like that or on garden tours or anything along those lines, I always come back inspired. And sometimes, if I'm lucky, I also come back with a few new plants. Now, the symposium includes a trade show where a lot of growers and breeders are present, and you have the opportunity not only to view new varieties of perennials that are just coming out or have recently been introduced in the last few years, you also have the opportunity to talk to them about these new varieties. So today I am going to be speaking about 5 of the new varieties out of the many that I saw there and that I will actually be adding to my own garden this year. The very first variety that caught my eye was in the Darwin's Perennial booth, and it is this little guy here, and this is a Stachys, and the variety name is Little Lamb. Now, this is a new introduction actually for next year, so it's not on the market quite yet. Now, it's the same species as the traditional lamb's ears, but as you can see, the leaves are much, much smaller, and it has a much more mat-like spreading habit. I did have the species in my garden for many, many years, but I really didn't like it. It was a little bit unruly, a little bit messy, and I don't know, there was something about those flower spikes that I didn't really like. The flowers on the Little Lamb are supposed to be much smaller and nicer than the very tall, fuzzy, kind of odd looking spikes on the species. Now, as I mentioned previously, this one is a low spreader and it does spread rather quickly. It is not aggressive though in its spread. It's perfect for a walkway or as a ground cover in a sunny spot. Now, as with most Stachys, this one does the best in full sun, and it goes all the way down to zone 4 and up to zone 8. In terms of size, it only gets about 2 to 5 inches tall, but it gets to 12 to 15 inches wide, which is, I would say, almost as wide as this one is here. I would actually venture to guess that it'll get wider than that once I get it in the ground. Now, this one here is a Nepeta, and it is related to the very popular Walker's Low. Nepeta is one of my favorite long-blooming perennials in the garden, but one of the problems that I often have, especially with the larger varieties, is that they tend to kind of sprawl and splay open halfway through the summer. Now, it's funny, I was actually at a friend's garden a couple of weeks ago, and she had Walker's Low in her garden, and it had splayed open in the middle, and we were kind of discussing how Nepeta generally is fairly long blooming, so what happens is it's splayed open, but there are still plenty of blooms there, and the pollinators still really, really like it. So there's a little bit of push and pull at that point, because it doesn't really look the best when it's kind of splayed open that way, but you feel kind of bad chopping it all the way back, which is technically the best thing to do, because there are still so many pollinators buzzing around it, right? But if you do chop it back, it'll flush back some new growth and it won't be all sprawly. Junior Walker does not splay open as readily as Walker's Low. It is a much more compact variety. It doesn't get as tall and it doesn't get as wide. It's also an earlier bloomer, so that's a big bonus. And it's more floriferous, so it gets more flowers than Walker's Low, so another bonus. So the specs on this one is it gets 18 inches tall by about 30 inches wide, and it is hardy from zones 4 to 8. It's also drought tolerant and deer resistant. So the next plant here that I'll talk about is this guy. I mean, who wouldn't love this? This is a Carex, and it is called ribbon Falls. I have a lot of Carex in my garden, but most of them are from the Ever series of Carex, so the ones that are called Ever something, like Ever Lime, Ever Oro, Ever Sheen, that kind of thing. This one, though, is from a different series, and it is a slightly different kind of Carex, although it is the same species. I don't really know how to pronounce it, but I think it's Oshamensis. So Carex Oshamensis. I saw this one in the Twixwood nursery booth, and I was immediately drawn in because the leaves were so glossy and shiny. It was just gorgeous, and that deep, deep green color. Now, this guy gets huge. It gets up to 2 feet tall and 5 feet wide, which is a huge difference from the Ever series ones, which get, I don't know, maybe a foot and a half wide, I think, at the most, and I don't know, not even a foot tall. I am going to have to find a pretty big spot to put this one. And apparently it gets that size within a couple of years. So in ideal conditions, I'm sure. The other one that they displayed as well was the variegated variety, which was also incredibly gorgeous. And I believe the specs are exactly the same. The variegated one is called Feather Falls. And the reason, though, that I chose this one over the variegated one was that, and you notice I can't stop touching this guy. The reason I picked this one over the variegated one was that all of the other Carex in my garden are variegated already. And I was really anxious to get something that was just a nice green color in the garden, but still had the beautiful structure and kind of, look at what it does in the wind. That kind of, I don't know what you call it, but you understand what I'm saying. Movement. That's the word I was thinking. It creates movement in the garden as well. Now, this one is good from zones 5 to 9, although I did see a few websites mentioning that it goes only down to zone 6. I'm in zone 5B, and I do have other Carex that also on some websites indicate they're down to zone 6, and they seem to do fine in my garden. So I'll just make sure, I guess, that I'm putting this in slightly more of a protected spot. So a spot that doesn't really get the full force of those really harsh westerly winds in the winter. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out about this one is that it does indicate it is resistant to rabbits. Now, I have not had any luck with rabbits and Carex, again, of the Ever series, in my garden. In fact, I've lost numerous ones from rabbits just nibbling them all the way down to the ground, and then they didn't end up coming back. However, this one does have a slightly thicker leaf, a slightly broader leaf, and I'm wondering if perhaps that is the difference between Bunny Buffet, and I think I'll leave this one alone. So at this point in time, I am going to put it in my fenced in area because I only have one of them and I don't want to lose it. So I am going to put it in that fenced in area, but perhaps in the future at some point, what I'll do is I'll get one and then test it in another area of the garden that has more rabbit pressure, and I'll make sure to let you know if it indeed is resistant to bunnies. The next one here that I have is a Jacobs Ladder. And this, I mean, you can see how gorgeous this is. And in a shady spot, this would absolutely glow and brighten that up. This cultivar here is called Golden Feathers for obvious reasons. The foliage emerges a beautiful variegated green and yellow, and then as it ages, that yellow kind of softens and becomes a creamier white color. It also gets tinges of pink on the leaves when the weather gets cooler. So when those cooler nights, that kind of thing, it's a beautiful color contrast there. And the stems are a gorgeous, gorgeous purple, like deep purple. Not the new stems, but the stems that are on the older leaves. They're gorgeous and make a beautiful contrast. And this one actually was a new introduction for this year in 2023. Now, I do have another variety of variegated Jacobs Ladder in my garden, and it's called Stairway to Heaven. It looks very similar, but the difference between that one, which I have, and this one is in the habit. The one that I have, Stairway to Heaven, grows in more of an upright kind of habit, whereas this one will form a beautiful mound of foliage, kind of like that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that. This one loves a nice shady spot, but the Darwin rep did say that she has heard of people planting it in a slightly sunnier spot and that it seems to do just fine there as well. Now, this one gets 6 to 8 inches tall, 12 to 14 inches wide, and it goes from zones 5B to 9A, and it is deer resistant. So the last plant that I'm going to talk to you about is actually already in my garden, and this one is the Perennial Plant Association's Plant of the Year for 2024, and it is the Phlox paniculata Jeana. Now, the reason it's in the garden and not out here is because I received it as a plug. So as soon as not as soon as I got home, but the next day, first thing in the morning, I plopped it into the garden right away. This particular variety of phlox was a chance discovery amongst a colony of phlox growing along the Harpeth River in Nashville, Tennessee. Of course, it was a woman named Jeana that discovered the variety. Now, what she noticed was amongst this colony of phlox, there was this one plant there that didn't seem to be affected by powdery mildew like the other plants were. And as anyone that's grown phlox knows, that's usually one of the biggest issues that it has. Now, Mount Cuba did some trials on a bunch of different phlox varieties, and this one landed right at the top of their list for powdery mildew resistance. Jeana does have smaller flowers than the traditional phlox that you see out there on the market, but it is not by any means a small plant. It's actually quite large. It grows 3 to 5 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet wide. I mean, not small. Mine right now is only about this big, so I'm really looking forward to see how it grows over the next couple of years. It's probably going to take a while for it to get to that size. Now, despite the smaller flowers, the Mount Cuba trials also found out something else that was really interesting about Jeana. It attracted more butterflies than any other variety they tested. It also blooms for quite a long time as well, from around mid-July to early September. Jeana is hardy from zones 3 to 8 and needs a full sunspot. And that about does it. Those are the 5 perennials that I learned about and that I brought home with me from the PPA symposium in Niagara Falls this year, and I am really excited to get them in the garden. Some of these are newer varieties, and I mean, of course, the Little Lamb isn't even going to be on the market until next year, and even the ones that are on the market right now, like the Jacobs Ladder, sometimes they're a little bit more difficult to find the first year or two after they're introduced, but just keep an eye out for them the next time you're at the nursery, and you may be in luck. This one I think has been around for several years, so that one should be relatively easy to find. And if it's not, and you're interested in one of these guys, it never hurts to go to your local garden center and ask for it and just say, hey, I heard about this particular variety, and are you guys planning on getting it in next season? A lot of times nurseries do listen to people that make suggestions. At least it puts the plant on their radar if it's not already. And if people are asking about it, there is a better chance that it may be coming in those doors in the spring. So I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we will see you next time. Bye.